Do you struggle to do everything that God says? If so, stay tuned because today I'm going to teach you how to fully be obedient to what God is telling you to do. What is going on, everyone? We are back for another episode of Prospering with Christ. I hope that you had a wonderful week last week, and I hope that this week will be just as amazing to you as well. So, for today's episode, we are discussing the topic of giving your full obedience to God. Last week, we discussed the topic of rebelling against God and doing the things that He tells us to do. And I felt like I should expunge on this topic a little bit and go a lot deeper and give you more understanding, because I want you to understand the importance of not only doing what God tells you to do, but making sure that you fully do what God tells you to do, making sure that you do every single part of what God tells you to do. Because if you're the type of person where you pick and choose what areas you want to follow, you pick and choose what parts you want to do, you pick and choose where you want to be obedient, I want you to understand that that is still disobedience. If you're the type of person who is not doing exactly what God tells you to do, you're still operating in disobedience. If you're the type of person where you eat the meat and you spit out the bones, you're still being disobedient. If you're the type of person where you look at the entire puzzle, but you only pick up a few pieces, you're still being disobedient. And this just came to me, so I want to say it. Some of us truly struggle to understand why things aren't working for us. We struggle to understand it because we feel like it's not like we're doing things our way. It's not like we're following other people's plans. We sought out God. We gave Him time to respond to us. He spoke to us. He gave us instructions, and we've been following those instructions, and things are not working. But if you really take a moment to look at your steps, if you really take a moment to analyze your progress, you have to ask yourself, have you fully been doing what God tells you to do? God gave you a blueprint. Have you been following that blueprint exactly to the T? Because when we start going off track on the things that God said, it takes the anointing off the things that God was trying to do. And so we're wondering why it isn't working. And God is saying, because this isn't exactly the plan that I gave you. This isn't exactly the instruction that I gave you. I need you to get back focused on me. I need you to get back on my plan. I need you to follow my plan to the T and stop adding in extra stuff and stop taking detours and stop doing other things. I need you to do exactly what I told you to do. And I know that some of you are going to listen to this and you're going to question, what does that look like? Like what does it look like to not follow God's plan and follow His blueprint exactly to the T? And I'm going to explain it to you. But first, I feel like it's important for you to understand what full obedience means. Full obedience means that you follow God's instructions completely without hesitation, alteration, or delay. See, people tend to think that disobedience is just completely ignoring what God said, like we saw Jonah do in last week's episode, where God gave him an instruction and told him to go somewhere, and he went completely opposite of where God told him to go. We think that disobedience is just saying no to God, saying I'm not doing that, not putting in any effort at all, not doing anything at all, doing the opposite of what He told us to do. But if you look at the definition that I just gave you, a part of disobedience is alteration, meaning making changes to what God told you to do. And I want you to understand, completely ignoring God's instructions is not the only way for you to be disobedient. There are multiple different ways that you can act in disobedience when it comes to God. The first way is by partial obedience. Partial obedience is when God gives you a plan and you only do parts instead of the whole thing. So let's say that God gave you a 5-step plan and you decide, I'm only going to do steps 2 and then I'm going to do steps 5. I'm not going to do everything that He tells me to do. I'm just going to pick out certain parts of this plan and only choose to do that. We act in partial disobedience, and then we wonder why we don't see results or why we don't see God moving in our life. And the reason why is because we're not listening. Picking out certain parts of what he said and only acting on those parts is not obedience. Obedience is doing everything that he told us to do, not half of what he told us to do, not the parts that seem interesting, not the parts that seem easy, but doing every little thing that he tells us to do. Every single instruction that he gives us, we act on it. And the reason why we move in partial disobedience could be for many different reasons. For some of you, it could be because you're impatient. Maybe God gave you, let's say, a 7-step plan, but you feel like, I want to see this thing happen in my life now. I've been waiting on this for years. I've been desiring this for a long time. Maybe I have a timeline and I need this to happen immediately. And I don't have time to go through a process. I don't have time to take it step by step. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to skip to the end. But what I don't realize is that every step builds off of each other, and that step 2 can't work without the foundation of step 1 laying underneath it. So if I try to just jump to step 7, I'm not going to see the result because there is no foundation of step 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. That's the reason why it's not working. Because I'm allowing my impatientness to move me instead of taking the process and going step by step by step. We don't realize that when we do step 1 is going to give us tools that's going to help us build step 2. And then step 2 is going to give us resources that's going to help us understand step 3. And then step 3 is going to build our network with people who can get us to step 4. See, you have to take the process because there's something that you have to get at every stage that's going to compound and build onto each other so that when you get to step 7 or when you get to step 5 or when you get to step 10, you're more likely to get the result. But rushing the process and trying to jump from step 0 to step 10 is the reason why you aren't seeing any results or not seeing God move, because it doesn't work like that. God's not just telling you to follow his blueprint exactly for no reason because he wants to be slow, because he wants you to be miserable. He's doing it for your benefit. Remember, just like we talked about last week in the story of Jonah, there are things that God is doing in ways that he is moving that you can't understand. But if you trust him, everything that he did will start to make sense. The second way that we disobey God is by doing more than what he told us to do. It's like God told you to do step 1, and you made the decision to add steps 2, 3, and 4 on top. And the problem with that is steps 2, 3, and 4 did not come from God. They came from you. So for example, let's say that God told you to write a book. He gave you the topic of the book. He gave you the name of the book. He told you the transformation that your readers need to get. And he told you to write the book. So you make the decision to act in obedience. You write the book. You finish the book. You make a cover, you self-publish on Amazon, you use their ISBN numbers, you start thinking about marketing strategies, and you think, hey, maybe I should reach out to local podcasters and try to get on their podcast so that they can interview me and that I can promote my book on there. And so you've been putting in all this work, self-publishing, reaching out to podcasters. You have some that's interested in you, some that's not. Your books aren't doing the numbers that you thought that they were going to do, because maybe when God told you to write the book, he told you that you will make $20,000 in book sales, and you're not seeing anywhere near $20,000. And now you're feeling frustrated. Now you're feeling discouraged. You're starting to question, like, God, what's going on? You promised that this book was going to do $20,000. It's not happening. Like, what's the problem? And God is saying, you moved in ways that I never told you to move. What I told you to do is I told you to write the book. I never told you to self-publish. I never told you to publish it on Amazon. I never told you to reach out to podcasters and get on there to market. I know that it seems logical to do all of that after you finish step 1. I know that it seems logical to start moving on to step 2 after you completed step 1. But what you don't realize is that if you would have just finished the book, completed God's instruction, and then took a moment to wait on him, God was going to align you with a publishing company, and they were going to create your book cover. They were going to set up your own ISBN number so that you have rights to your book. They weren't going to just have you go on podcasts to do interviews. They were going to get you speaking engagements on stages that will pay you to come speak. And then you can speak to hundreds of thousands of people and then promote your book to all those people. God had a greater plan, but you decided to do more than what he told you to do. You decided to add extra steps and extra instructions on something that he told you to do. See, you were obedient because you wrote the book, but disobedience came when you start doing more and you start running ahead of God. And like I said, I understand why we do this, because after you complete step 1, it sounds silly not to move on to step 2. After you went through the trouble of writing this book, spending months or even a year writing this book, and the book is good and it's finished, it sounds stupid to not publish it. It sounds stupid to just sit on it. But sometimes the reason why God only gives us one step at a time and he waits before he gives us the next instruction is because he's trying to build your patience. He's trying to build your level of faith and trust in him. He's trying to see if you will go against something that feels stupid. It feels stupid to sit on a book. It feels stupid to complete step 1 and not move to step 2. He's trying to see if you will go against what feels stupid and wait on him. And if you do, you'll realize that the reward from him is greater and better than any reward that you could have created. The third way that we act in disobedience kind of goes along with way number 2 that I just said, but it's when you mix God's ways and God's instructions with your ways and your instructions. But the difference between this and way number 2 is I feel like way number 2 is a little bit more unintentional, because it's like you start off following God and doing what God told you to do. But I feel like you get so excited, you get so amped up that you just unintentionally start moving ahead of him and you start doing more than what he instructed you to do. But this way is a little bit different, because it's like maybe you don't fully agree with what God is telling you to do. Maybe you don't understand what God is telling you to do. Maybe you have desires that don't align with the things that God has been instructing for you. And so what you try to do is you try to mix what God said with what you want. You try to mix God's instructions with your plan. You try to put them together to perfect something that you desire. So an example of this would be like, let's say God told you to start a business. He wants you to start a business mentoring young people and helping young people. You agree with starting a business. That's something that you desire. But the process that God gives you to start that business is completely different than a process that you want to go by. God's process is to wait a little bit. Focus on building connections with people. Focus on building relationships with people. But you're just like, no, that sounds really silly. That sounds really stupid. I'm not really a people person anyway. I don't have friends. I'm a loner. I love isolation. What I want to do is I want to start building this business and I want to start making money from it. So I'm going to start putting the business together. I may build connections with people along the way, but I'm also going to build the business at the same time. So once you start building the business, you start realizing that the money to fund the business costs more than what you have, and you make the decision to take out some loans. So now you are drowning in debt and you're trying to build a business, but your business is not bringing the return needed in order to pay off those loans and get you out of debt. And now you're stuck and you're debating filing for bankruptcy because you tried to mix what God said with what you desired. You tried to take both plans and put them together. But what you didn't realize is that the reason why God wanted you to focus on building relationships is because those relationships were going to be beneficial to your business. He was going to align you with investors who was going to invest in your business so that you never had to drown in debt and you never had to take out loans. He was going to align you with a marketing expert who was going to give you the strategies to put your business out there, market it, message it correctly, and get returns. He was going to align you with people who had the same purpose as you because they were going to come and work at your company and help build the vision that he gave you. The reason why he told you to focus on relationships is because he wanted you to build your skill of relationships, of communication, of negotiation, of being a people person, because he knows that you're the type of person who likes to isolate. He knows that you're an introvert. So he had a better plan. He had a bigger plan, but because you were so focused on your flesh and what you desired and what you felt like you should do, you fumbled what God was trying to do. All of these are acts of disobedience that we partake in every single day, picking and choosing which parts of God's plan we want to follow, doing more than what God told us to do, doing less than what God told us to do, doing the bare minimum of what God told us to do, and mixing our plans with God's plans. There's more ways too. There's ways like doing what God said fully, but taking our time and procrastinating. Where it's like, okay, God told you to write the book, but you've been putting it off. Maybe I'll write the book next month. Maybe I'll write the book in a year. Maybe I'll write the book when I have more experience. Maybe I'll write the book when I'm older because I feel like I'm too young for that. That's still disobedience. Agreeing to do it, but not actually fulfilling it or putting off the time of when you're going to fulfill it is disobedience. There's so many different ways that we disobey God. In all of these ways, if you're acting in any of these, if as I'm saying them, if they sound familiar, if you are listening to this and you're like, yeah, maybe I do add on to what God told me to do. Maybe I do pick and choose which parts I want to follow. Maybe I am slow to, actually do what he told me to do. Like if any of these ways sound familiar, I want you to understand that as long as you make the decision to act in these ways, you are going to hinder your prayers. I understand that you've been frustrated. I understand that you've been feeling like I'm doing what God told me to do. I'm listening and it's not working. But you have to ask yourself, are you fully listening to what he said? Are you adding on to what he said? Are you not doing exactly what he said? Exactly means no more, no less. Are you fully obeying God? Because if you aren't, that you can't blame God. You can't get frustrated at him for not moving. You can't get frustrated for not seeing his hand because you are still acting in disobedience. Are you enjoying this episode so far? Is this episode teaching you how to fully obey God? If so, I want you to do me two favors. Favor number one, I want you to leave a review. You can leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening to this episode. Leave an honest review and let me and others know how you are enjoying the show. And favor number two, if you know anyone who has been frustrated because they've been feeling like I'm doing what God told me to do, but it's not working, I want you to send this episode to them. Let this episode motivate and encourage them the same way that it's motivating and encouraging you. Now let's get back to the show. As I was preparing for this episode, I started to question, why do we struggle so much to follow God's plan to the T? And I feel like one of the main reasons is out of fear. So, for example, when you partially do what God told you to do, you're basically picking and choosing what parts you want to take. Maybe some parts scare you. Maybe step 1 seems very easy, but step 5 feels very intimidating. And then step 7 feels very uncomfortable. And so what you do is you pick the parts that feels easy to you, that feels comfortable to you, that doesn't stretch you, that doesn't pushes you out your comfort zone, that doesn't frighten you. You choose to do the parts that make you still feel comfortable. For the people who like to mix their plan with God's plan, it's the same thing as the people who are partially obedient, but the difference is The parts that makes you uneasy, you replace those with things that make you feel easy. They're not things that God told you to do. There's things that you know to do. There's things that you heard about. There's things that you're desiring to do. And you replace those steps that God gave you with your steps so that the whole process seems easy to you, so that the whole process seems comfortable to you. I'll give you an example. God had told me to start a podcast, right? That was step one. When I first started my podcast, I started doing audio only. But eventually, let's just say step 3 was to turn my podcast into a video where there's a video version. The video made me very, very uncomfortable at first. I got used to it now, but when I first started, I was very uncomfortable. But let's say that I was the type of person who liked to mix my plans with God's plans. So I agreed, yes, I'm going to continue to do my podcast. Yes, I'm going to do video. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do animations, where instead of it being me, there's going to be clips that goes along with what I'm talking about. That's going to be the video version. It's like I'm finding something more comfortable that I know about to replace the parts of God's plan that pushes me out my comfort zone, that makes me uneasy, that's something that I don't desire. We mostly do this out of fear. Even for the people who are procrastinators and there's things that God told you to do and you just constantly put it off. I feel like you're putting it off because you're afraid. And when I think to why you're afraid, why are you so afraid that you're not even willing to take that step? You're not even willing to step out and try. I feel like it's because deep down inside, you don't really trust him. You don't trust that if you take a step and you take a chance and you do this thing that God is calling you to do, you don't trust that it will work. And so I feel like your procrastination is you holding on to your power, where you have the power to say, well, it didn't work because I chose not to do it. You are so afraid that if you step out and try and this does not work, then God is not good. Then God is not as powerful as you thought he was, that God lied to you, that God misled you. You want to hold on to the image that you have of him and you want to use your power to do it. You're afraid that if you step out, you try and it doesn't work, that you are a failure. Instead of looking at this experience as this is just a situation that failed, you make that failure your identity and you view yourself from that light. And you're so afraid of labeling yourself a failure that you are holding on to your control and you are holding on to your power and you're making the decision not to move. You're making the decision to procrastinate. You're making the decision to constantly put it off. But it's important for you to understand that number one, when it comes to protecting God's image, he does not need you to protect who he is. Let's say that you stepped out and you failed. It does not mean that God isn't good. It may just mean that there's something that you need to learn here. Failure builds character. Failure builds experience. Failure builds skill. Because every time you fail, you learn what not to do next time. So every time you do it again, you get better at it and better at it and better at it till you succeed. So you failing does not mean that God isn't good. You failing does not mean that you should label yourself as a failure. You failing means that you are one step closer to succeeding. You have to change your perspective. Instead of labeling yourself a failure, you say to yourself, I am one step closer to succeeding. You cannot allow fear to drive you to disobedience. You have to make the decision to start fully and wholeheartedly obeying and following every single thing that God tells you to do. So if you want to make the decision to fully obey God, there are 4 steps that you should take. The first step is to identify your area of disobedience. I want you to ask yourself these 3 questions. Number 1, is there something God has been asking you to do that you have been avoiding or procrastinating? Number 2, are there areas where you've obeyed God partially, where you picked and choose, what you were going to follow, or you tried to justify not following God's instructions fully? And number 3, are you holding on to fear, pride, or personal desires that conflict with God's will? These questions are going to help you identify areas in your life where you've been acting in disobedience. And not only that, it's going to help you understand why. Because if you ask yourself question number 1 and then you get an answer on question number 1, you realize that you've been doing it out of fear, and then you can identify why you've been afraid. The second thing that you want to do is you want to act immediately. Whenever you get an instruction from God, stop waiting to do it and take action now. Take action immediately. This does not mean that you have to do it right there in a moment, because sometimes you won't be able to. You have a life. Maybe God spoke to you while you're at work. Maybe God spoke to you while you're with your spouse. Maybe God spoke to you while you're with your children. So sometimes you can't act in the moment, but you want to make the decision to try and do it as fast as possible. When you give yourself time and you wait to take action on the things that God told you to do, what you're doing is you're allowing yourself the time to talk yourself out of doing it. The more you sit on it, the more you dwell on it, the more the enemy can get inside your ear. And so what you want to do is you want to move before you even have the option to talk yourself out of it. You want to move before you even start thinking about all the cons and the worries and the doubts and the negative things. You want to move as fast as possible. The third thing that you want to do is, if there's something that God has told you to do and you find yourself struggling, I want you to ask yourself why. Why are you struggling? Ask yourself, are you afraid, impatient, tired, or discouraged? And if so, then why are you afraid? Why are you impatient? Why are you tired? Why are you discouraged? Ask yourself what's causing you to be tempted to disobedience. Asking these questions are going to help you get to the root of why you're feeling this way. And once you figure that out, you can take that to God and you can get His help in that area. And the fourth thing that I want you to do is I want you to repent, get up, and do it. We tend to make our mistakes our identity, where we feel like if I mess up, if I make the decision to be disobedient, that's just the end all be all. It's too late. But like I said in last week's episode, it's not too late. Go back to that episode, listen to the story of Jonah. Jonah made the decision to be disobedient and do the opposite of what God called him to do. And once he was suffering the consequence, he called out to God, and God showed him mercy and gave him another chance. And the same way that God did that for Jonah, God will do it for you. Your mistake does not define you. You messing up does not define you. It is not too late for you. Call on God. Reach out to God, apologize to God, and get up and follow Him. And so my action step for you this week is I want you to look over all the different ways that you can act in disobedience that we talked about today. The ways of doing part of what He says, doing more of what He says, mixing your ways with His ways, being slow to obedience, doing less of what He said. Look at all of those different ways, and I want you to determine which way have you been acting in. If you're the type of person where you have been so frustrated because you just feel like you've been following God, you've been doing what He said, and things are not working, I want you to look over those ways and ask yourself, does any of those apply to your situation? And if you find that it does, determine why and take it back to God. But that is all that I have for you today. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure that you subscribe so that you get a notification every time a new episode is released. Also, leave a review and let me and others know how you enjoyed the show. And if you want to stay connected, follow me on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook at Prospering with Christ. But that's all I have for you today, and I will see you next week.